Well, the new spring season is well underway, and as usual, I'm trying out pretty much everything and only sticking with it as long as it holds my attention. So let's check out the new entries and see what the fuck am I looking at. To be honest, the opening dialogue of actually had me a bit interested because the first two characters we see start trading sexual banter without even batting an eye, but the shot composition actually makes me want to vomit. There's also this air of emotionlessness that's preventing me from getting truly attached to anyone, like how the main character doesn't show any emotion regarding the news that his father has died, or more importantly, a reason for why he wouldn't show any emotion. Given the consistent level of awfulness lately, I don't really know why I still give adaptations of visual novels the time of day other than Steins Gate and Clannad exist. But despite the obvious time travel allusions, this is definitely no Steins Gate. Okay, apparently this is another one of those shows where it's basically a tourism advertisement for a certain prefecture, but it's also a really terrible comedy because most of the punchlines are just this girl screaming. It's kind of surreal though because everything happens so fast that my brain didn't have time to fully process anything for like the first minute or so, and I just sat in awe at the car crash I was witnessing. So, if you're into that, well, there you go. Next. You know, there weren't a lot of shows I was hyped for this season, but the Fruits Basket remake was definitely one of them, and it's mostly meeting my expectations so far, which is a huge relief. It's hard to find an anime with as wholesome and positive a reputation amongst anime fans as the original Fruits Basket, and the remake seems to hold the same endearing qualities so far. I love that they're not shying away from the classic shoujo tropes that have mostly gone out of fashion in recent years, and the characters have the same charm and vibrance to them that I remember from the original. My only real concern at this point is the visual presentation. It's certainly much more competent than most of the other shows airing this season, but there are a few stylistic choices that I'm not the biggest fan of. I'm not sure why there are so many fade transitions, but it does get a bit distracting because they don't really work all the time. And I'm definitely not liking the CG smoke effects for the transformation scenes, but these are mostly minor nitpicks in an otherwise solid production. Charm really is the best word to use here, and I hope it can keep up this atmosphere for when it digs into the heavier stuff later on. Unfortunately, charm can only carry a series so far, and Hitoribochi no Marumaru Seikatsu doesn't really have much else to offer aside from the charm of its premise. There's nothing that I'd say is outright wrong with it. The jokes occasionally got a decent chuckle out of me, and having the MC's name literally mean alone was a nice touch, but I'm not really getting anything I haven't seen elsewhere and done better. The visuals occasionally give us some decent gags, but overall are mostly unambitious, and unambitious anime comedies are a dime a dozen, so I think I'll search elsewhere for my laughs this season. Clever ideas for new anime series are always welcome. Senryu Shoujo works through characterization that's quite meaningful, though gimmicks get old without strong visual aid. We'll see what happens. Man, there sure are a lot of TV and web shorts airing this season. A shame most of them aren't very good. I don't really have much to say about this one other than how obnoxious all the characters are, and for an ecchi comedy, it seems pretty light on the comedy. And also the ecchi. So I'm giving this one a hard no for not giving me a hard on. Okay, I had actually planned to watch Touch at some point since Mix is technically a sequel, but I figured I could jump in anyway since there's so much of a gap in between the two. And while there definitely weren't any issues in that department, there are plenty other issues that discouraged me from continuing. The narrator is extremely intrusive right off the bat, and because of that the pacing in the first present day scene felt way off base and dragged on forever by repeating all the information that we got from the scene preceding it. A shame that this one stumbles so hard off the mound, but that's certainly not a rarity nowadays, so I'm gonna walk away from this one before I notice any more errors. Man, there sure are a lot of TV and web shorts airing this season. A shame most of them aren't very good. There really isn't much for me to say here that I haven't already said about other shows this season. Obnoxious characters, bizarre and confusing pacing, and unappealing visuals make this a treasure trove of terrible storytelling. Next. You know, I was kinda expecting something a bit raunchier considering how Mother's Basement portrayed it, but then I read that thought out loud to myself and I realized how dumb it was. I wouldn't necessarily say I found this one funny, but it certainly held my attention for its 3 minutes of runtime. Not enough to bring me back for another episode, but at least they tried. Can't say that much for Mr. Nobunaga's young bride though. I honestly can't remember the last time I saw something so lifeless and uninspired, and it really escapes me as to why someone would even be interested in this.
子作りを始めるとしましょう。
Okay, please bear with me on this one because I have a lot of conflicted feelings to sort through. On the one hand, the plot itself is pretty solid. It's an extremely faithful adaptation of the first chapter of the manga, and when the shonen ideology comes into play in the back half, it really ramps up in intensity and makes me genuinely interested in where the main character will go from here. Occasionally it gets a bit too repetitive and some emotional beats don't land as well as others, but on a writing level, this is a strong episode. The visuals are another story entirely, because the first half of this episode might honestly be one of the ugliest things Ufotable has ever made. This is part of an ever-growing issue I've had with this studio in their post-UBW works, but Ufotable seems to have no interest whatsoever in properly integrating their characters into the backgrounds. Said backgrounds, while extremely detailed and meticulously constructed, are very obviously CG, and without proper compositing and camera focus, placing 2D characters on top of that makes for an absolute eyesore. I mean, fucking Pokemon figured this out like 4 years ago, so there's no excuse for not being able to do it here. Then there's all the times they swapped out the 2D character models for CG ones in seemingly the most mundane of shots. You'd think that Ufotable of all studios would be able to properly plan out animation work so that shortcuts like this wouldn't be necessary, but then again, they are under investigation for tax evasion, so maybe they're not that smart after all. There's also something about the general cinematography that really rubs me the wrong way. It has this sense of awkwardness in regards to the shot composition that makes everything feel like it's not quite where it's supposed to be. The frame is too cluttered, the subject is too close or too far away, etc. These problems do die down a bit around the climax, so I'm really hoping that this episode just got off to a bad start. Perhaps the story and themes will carry it through, so I'll stick with it for now, but I'm honestly not counting on it. You know, if you had told me We Never Learn was going to be a contender for most expressive animation this season, I probably would have had you committed. And yet, here we are with a ton of energized and exciting cuts adapting what is otherwise a fairly standard rom-com. I wouldn't exactly say I'm a huge fan of the manga, but it has a solid central theme regarding genius and the purpose of talent that I hope will be a bit more condensed in this anime adaptation, as it often gets watered down in the manga by some less than stellar comedy. Above all else, what this story needs to do is remain consistently moving forward and free of anything that could drag its episodic stories to a halt. The visual presentation and pacing are doing a pretty good job of that so far, and I'm kinda surprised by how much work the soundtrack is doing as well. Overall, this is a surprisingly strong first episode, despite the middle section lagging just a bit, and I'm rather eager to see more. Okay, what's next? Oh good. Another anime with terrible art direction and annoying characters. You know, for a second there, I thought I was actually having fun this season. Like, I can tell there's an interesting story buried in here somewhere, but it's certainly not going to be found in something so visually unappealing. If it's trying to sell me on how great the Koto is, then it's doing a terrible job by not having any Koto music in the first half of the episode. Forgive me if I sound overly harsh, but I'm still half music major, and that half of me is telling me to chuck this in the bin. Next. Oh hey, I didn't know the Dark Continent arc of Hunter x Hunter was getting adapted this season. Kind of a weird direction to go with Kurapika, but whatever. This show is actually pretty great so far. It's got that shonen adventure feel down pat, the world it's exploring is fresh and exciting, and yet there's this ever-present sense of darkness that constantly warns of danger, with the ending of the first episode definitely reinforcing that idea. It's also incredibly striking in its visual presentation, especially with such a vibrant color palette and strong character designs. Digging up these little known shonen properties and seeing how they play out is always fun, and this one's already come out swinging, so I'm definitely on board for now. Holy fuck, this show is boring. How is it that some shows can cram so much plot into such a short space and yet say so little about the actual story? Just spelling out the premise of the show isn't enough to hook an audience, especially with a setting as worn out as this one. On top of that, this is easily one of the flattest looking PA Works anime I've ever seen, with totally unassuming character designs and completely unengaging animation. This is just flat out bad. Next. Okay, why does supernatural shit always happen in Shinjuku? Can't they just, like, fuck off to Setagaya for one season or something? This one's actually a lot more engaging than I expected, and by that I mean it at least has some life and excitement to it. It's pretty far outside my comfort zone in terms of genre, and I don't really have a particular interest in yokai stuff, but the more business-like perspective was surprisingly engaging and framed it in a way that made the conflict much more interesting. I also wasn't surprised at all that the director of photography worked on a lot of Durarara, because his prints are all over this series and how the city is portrayed, giving tons of life to this concrete jungle. I'm not sure how many episodes I'll get through of this, but for now it's entertaining enough for me to stick with it. Well, I was pretty sure this wasn't my fetish, but now I'm not so sure anymore. This is probably the first ecchi series since Shimonetta that I've enjoyed this much. The show absolutely does not give a fuck, and it's actually avoiding most of the awful ecchi rom-com tropes. Plus, the animation's not too shabby either. Strong character designs and perfect framing make for a tantalizing experience to say the least, which I guess is to be expected from the director of Seikon no Quasar, Makin Ki 2, and Surezure Children? Well, how about that?
He has been chosen.
Hey, what are you doing? Stop it! Stop again, zealots!
What the fuck just happened? Anyway, this show is surprisingly hilarious so far. A new series helmed by Shinji Takamatsu is always going to grab my attention because Gintama, and his comedic style shines through brilliantly here. Great dialogue, quick pacing, a strong sense of media history, and lovable yet kinda stupid characters combine for a solid series of punchlines that rarely let up on the gas. It's certainly not the best visually, but there's nothing I'd say is particularly ugly or poorly animated either. Shows like this one are the reason I check out everything that airs each season because you never know what's gonna slip through the cracks. And I hope this one can stay as strong as it is now for the rest of the series. Okay, to answer the question that I'm sure some of you are wondering, no, this is nowhere near as clever as Carnival Phantasm. In hindsight, this was probably the reason why I was so excited to watch it, but it's mostly mediocre so far, as you can probably tell by the flash animation. It also doesn't help that I only like half of the shows it's based on, while I'm either bored to death by or actively hate the other two. Maybe if I get to watch Subaru get gruesomely murdered a few times it'll be worth it, but I don't see that happening considering how tame this first episode was, so I think I'll pass.
Look how they mess with my boy.
Alright, I know everyone's been railing on the new One Punch Man for the massive downgrade in animation, and unfortunately, pretty much everything you've heard is true, so I'm not gonna dwell on that and waste your time. What I do want to point out is that this season's problems go much deeper than just the animation. Practically everything has taken a hit. The comedic timing is horrible, setup and payoff is non-existent, the pacing doesn't know what it wants to go for, and the shot composition is bland and unengaging. I might further expand on these in a later video, but suffice to say that One Punch Man has lost basically everything that made the first season so fun. In other news, the Fox Girl show mostly delivered on everything I was expecting. Warm color palette, inviting character designs, and an extremely relaxing atmosphere that you can just melt into, as expected of Doga Kobo. It even has a strong emotional beat to tie everything together. Despite this, I don't really feel like watching any more of it. What I saw was pretty solid, but I don't see myself watching that 11 more times. There's no hook that has me invested in what's gonna happen next. This has been an issue with a lot of shows I've seen recently, but sometimes a concept that might work great as a one-shot doesn't necessarily lend itself to a full season of broadcast. Now, I could very well be completely off the mark here, and the series could evolve into something else entirely, but I don't see it being able to do that without sacrificing some of the elements that made this first episode so strong. Maybe I'll check out another episode or so after a long day of work, which is basically what this show is for, but I highly doubt I'll ever finish it. You know, I honestly have hardly anything to say about this one. It's literally just an isekai. No interesting hook, no unique world building, no complex magic mechanics. It's fucking isekai brand isekai. Totally generic and pointless. I could talk about how the cinematography was so bad that it made my head hurt, but if the first 3 minutes of this show actually had you intrigued, then there's no reason for me to talk about the fucking cinematography, because your bar must be set so fucking low that you just don't give a shit. That's the long and short of it. Sorry if that offends you, but that mindset is so far removed from my own that I just can't understand it. This is isekai trash hard stop. Please, for the love of God, show me something great. It's rare enough that even one of the anime industry's all-stars comes out with a new project, but two at the same time is enough to get me hyped beyond belief. First, we have a new sci-fi music drama led by Shinichiro Watanabe. As I mentioned in my recent Kids on the Slope video, one of my favorite characteristics of Watanabe is his incorporation of music into the narrative. And Carol and Tuesday seems to be the most direct he's been with this concept so far. It's honestly kinda hard to pick a starting point because this first episode does so many things right. A great duo of protagonists, each with their own struggles they need to work through, a well-realized and unique setting that's thematically relevant to the story, a strong sense of cinematography that shows how to perfectly portray each scene to convey the emotion best suited for it at the moment, an eclectic mix of music genres that all work together to convey what this show plans to be about, and above all else, an intensely emotional, though still very subdued, narrative core that seems desperate to have people pay attention and listen to what it has to say. This might sound like an exaggeration, but I actually started crying at the climax of their first jam session because the pacing and cinematic elements worked so well together in creating a perfect moment of realization. There is some genuine artistry going on in this first episode, despite a few moments where the animation is a bit lacking, and I can't wait to see where it goes from here. As for the other all-star director, Kunihiko Ikuhara is back with his extremely auteur stylizations in Sarazanmai. Admittedly, I'm not nearly as familiar with him as I am with Watanabe, and Ikuhara is much more obtuse when it comes to what he's trying to say. There are some pretty obvious signifiers of consumerism, identity, and sexuality, but I'm not exactly sure where it's going yet, or if I'm even going to be able to parse through the neutron star levels of dense imagery packed into every frame of this show, but to be honest, that makes me even more excited to find out. Beyond that, it's easily one of the best looking shows this season, as is typical of a Noitamina block entry. Ikuhara is definitely letting MAPPA put their best foot forward so they can create some absolutely gorgeous imagery contrasted against whatever the fuck this is. Combined with an intense electronic backbeat of a soundtrack to keep everything constantly moving forward, this is definitely a show I want to be along for the ride with for now. And that pretty much covers everything. Here's a list of all the shows I personally recommend in order from best to worst. As I said last season, I expect about half of these will be dropped at some point, but that's just how it is. Let me know what you think of this season so far and what shows you're watching in the comments below. Finally done. couple weeks late, but whatever. What's next? I wonder how many shows I have left from the winter season. Fuck. Special thanks to Jan Rogalski, Rourke Tenjoin, Christine Seibert, Tim Johnson, Call Me Catlord, Ember's fave roommate, Eugenio Mendoza, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.